Today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Chapter 1, Lesson 7, which is false casting. We'll talk about false casting in a second in terms of letting you see what it looks like. But false casting is used for a number of different reasons. We false cast to measure distance, so we don't go too far too short. We do it to extend line. We do it to dry a fly. We can do it to kind of see what a line feels like on a rod and get a feel for that. So false casting is multi-use kind of a skill, and it's going to be the heart and soul of all the different skills. Unless we can false cast, for instance, well with one hand, we can't cast distance even if we learn how to double haul. So the false cast with one hand is probably the fundamental basic thing. It's more like the blocking and tackling of football, the specific blocking and tackling of football. If you go back to the Chapter 1, lessons 1 through 6, you're going to see a lot of the basic fundamental things that allow us to get to false casting. And so we're going to use those things and talk about them, but we're going to add to all the things we've talked about. We've already talked about smooth acceleration to an appropriate stop. We've talked about the fact that you can't have slack. We've talked about the fact that the loop is created by the way the line by how the rod tip moves. Wherever the rod tip moves, that's going to determine how the loop is formed, what direction it goes, what size it is, what shape it is. And then we talked about the fact that you need to pause when we did the pick up and lay down. You have to pause behind you before you come forward because you have to let it straighten out. The last principle we're going to talk about is the one today, and that's going to be timing. If you wait too long in the back and too long in the front, your line sags and you're going to have slack, and that's going to cause a problem. If you don't wait long enough, you've got slack, and that's going to cause a problem. So you got to be sort of like Goldilocks, just right. You have to wait until that line at least almost turns over, at least the line itself is almost turned over. The leader doesn't have to necessarily be turned over, but when I say turnover, that means it unrolls. So we'll talk about that. Before I do that, let me just talk about, here, right now we have a wind blowing from your right to your left. And I always have a ribbon, and you're going to see this in the background on a lot of the casts that we do. The reason I have this, if I were to turn around and cast this way with that wind blowing into my shoulder, so I'm casting like this and the wind's coming in this direction, it's going to hit it's going to cause my fly to hit my rod or even myself. So especially when I am actually practicing, it's a lot easier to practice most of the time keeping track of where the wind is. You're going to see me turn and do different things because in all of these videos I have to consider where the wind is and also the background, and so you can see the line. So that's why some of this stuff is always, we're changing around. So this is the ribbon, and we're going to use it today. And if you're interested in wind cast, we have a wind cast, how to cast in a wind video. Please look at that, because there are sometimes when you're fishing you can't do anything about it. You're going to have to cast with the wind blowing into your casting shoulder. So there are different ways to compensate for that. A couple of new terms we're going to have today. So we're going to reinforce these, but right now, if I cast straight towards you, that's the vertical plane. So this is what we consider to be the vertical plane. This is a horizontal plane. Here where the plane, our casting plane, is at 45 degrees. If I cast and my line goes down in the front, and my back cast goes up, that's a downward trajectory. So this would be the trajectory, a downward trajectory in the front and an upward trajectory in the back. This would be an upward trajectory in the front and a downward trajectory in the back. This is a level trajectory. So trajectory is another term we're going to use. So these are terms that we're going to use quite frequently during the course of the rest of the tapes. But those are terms we need to understand what those terms are. We've already talked a little bit about tracking. This is good tracking. This is bad tracking, although there are times when you want to use this kind of a cast for different reasons. But generally speaking, you want your rod tip to go on a straight line. The straighter your rod tip goes on a straight line, the more likely it is you're going to have a good loop. So all those things are considered when we talk about loops. So what I'm going to do first is just demonstrate a couple loops, and then we're going to talk about the loops, and we're going to show you how to progressively get to those loops. So let's look at a couple of false cast loops to start, and then we'll actually do a couple of drills or exercises to help you get those loops the way you want them. So what we're going to do is just to pick up, and then instead of laying it down, we're just going to continue to false cast, and we're going to try to get a fairly level trajectory. So we're going to be using the skills that we've already learned. So this is a fairly level trajectory. Here's going to be a downward trajectory in the front, up, and the back. This is an upward trajectory in the front and a downward trajectory in the back. So a level trajectory. So those are all, that's false casting. So if you watch me from here, actually I need to do it from right here. Watch my rod. This is vertical plane. This is the horizontal plane. So we need to cast in all those different planes depending on the circumstances. So we'll practice that. This is a 45-degree plane. So that's basically false casting. Let's talk about the rules of false casting, or at least some of the drills we can do to false cast. If I get back where my line drill was, and I like to start false casting, if you haven't done it a lot, false casting starting with this drill. Remember this drill, we stood in the middle cone, and if you haven't seen the drill, go back to the line drill. And all we're going to do is this, and we try to make the line straight and parallel to the ground. Now what we're going to do is just, instead of pausing for a long time and letting it rest, we're going to pause less and less until we finally get it up. And then we're just going to be right here. Now, when you're in this position, you can actually see the turquoise cone here and the turquoise cone here. If you stop your rod at this cone, and if you stop your rod at this cone, you're going to get a pretty good loop. Remember that the longer the line, the bigger the casting arc, the shorter the line, the shorter the casting arc. If you put this cone 6.5 or 7 feet from the center cone, and this cone 6.5 or 7 feet from the center cone, you're going to have some pretty good loops. And you're just going to work your way up, constant acceleration to a good stop. Nice tracking. Remember, you're not going up and down with your rod tip. Nice tracking, straight across like it's on a rope or a table. And then we're just going to go up. Keep your eyeball on those turquoise cones. If your rod starts doing this, you're using too much wrist, and you can look, eventually we're going to have a nice little video on troubleshooting, but that'll be a little while. Maybe it's up by the time you look at this. But right here, I'm still, through the corner of my eye, I can see that turquoise cone. And I'm stopping when my rod gets to that turquoise cone. The same thing here. Stop, stop, stop. And I'm not making particularly good loops. I'm just practicing, just making sure I'm stopping. If I wanted to make narrower loops, I have to shorten my casting arc just a little bit. If I want to make wider loops, I increase my piece of the pie. So your piece of the pie is to determine the shape of your loop, assuming you have the same amount of line out. One of the problems most people have is that they try to use too much wrist. They do this. And you can see my wrist moving back and forth. If I have too much wrist, I have a tendency to, you can see the casting arc, even if you can't see the whole line, you can see my rod. You can see the tendency for my rod to make too big a piece of pie, which is going to make a big, huge loop. So by reducing the amount of wrist you have, you can increase, now you can decrease the size of your loop. So what you want to do is start down here and just work your way up. Make sure you just work your way up a little bit at a time. If you start using too much wrist, come back down again and use the cones as a crutch sort of to do it. The other thing you can do is you can stick your rod in your sleeve like this if you have a long sleeve shirt, or get a piece of two-sided Velcro and strap it on here. Both those things might help. So now you can cast, and this is going to prevent you from using too much wrist. You can still use some, but you can't use a whole lot of wrist. Now I've got the wind blowing a little bit incorrectly, and the line is blowing into itself a little bit. But so use this. Think about your casting arc. Think about the fact that the more line you have, the bigger your casting arc. The less line you have, the lesser or the smaller your casting arc. And if you're using too much wrist, you're probably going to end up with too big a casting arc. Remember what we talked about as far as the clock. If you're sitting here and I'm casting towards the front of me. For this purposes, because it would be from this side over here, but if I'm casting here, for this particular case, I just want to go between 10 and 2 for this amount of line. Now, if I had 60 feet of line, I'd want to go between, let's say, 230 and 930. If I have 100 feet of line, I might actually want to go almost to 3 o'clock and to 9 o'clock. So if your loop is too big, remember to cut down your piece of pie. Now, the other thing I'd like you to do, we're going to zoom back out again, and we're going to look at timing. Okay, so let's take a loop at timing. Remember, too long of a pause and your line dips. And also, if you're not going fast enough, the speed of your line we're going to talk about later, but the faster you go, the longer your line is going to stay straight rather than dip. So we want to have nice enough speed that we can maintain our line in a fairly straight line. So when it straightens out, it's still fairly straight behind us and in front of us. If we go too slow, it's going to sag. So we're going to go through a couple of different scenarios, and you're going to take a look at these and see so you can recognize in your own casting if you're having a problem. Here we go. So the first one we're going to do, so this is pretty good timing. You can see the line is fairly straight, and I start the next one, there's very little sag. Now watch what happens if I wait too long. Very inefficient loop. It's one of those wide loops that you looked at on the loop video. What if we don't wait long enough? Then you're likely to get a tail. And look at my loop in the front. That's what's going to happen. So just remember that regardless of the speed and the force or the acceleration that you use, the casting arc is going to remain fairly similar. It's going to get a little bit bigger when you go real fast with the equal, assuming the line is equal, but it's not going to go a lot bigger. It's not going to get, just because you've got 40 feet of line and your casting arc is here, you don't all of a sudden make it here. It's going to mess up your loop. So you need to just stay right here and just go a little faster. You may have to broaden it out just a tiny little bit, but not a lot. So I hope this helps with a little bit of false casting, but it's really important. I do this drill all the time. I play with all kinds of different loops. I try to open my loops, shorten my loops, cast more line, less line, trying to remember that my pause becomes shorter as my line becomes shorter. My timing gets quicker. There's a lot of different things. Of course, your pause, remember, the faster you cast, the less your pause is going to be because your line gets back there or in front faster. So I hope this helps with false casting. We're going to do some other drills, and you can also look at some of the CI tasks and some of the CI tasks and teaching activities to get some more insight into loops. And I hope this was helpful and that you can use this to make yourself a better fisherman.